The term Soviet Nonconformist Art refers to art produced in the former Soviet Union from 1953 to 1986 outside of the rubric of Socialist Realism. Other terms used to refer to this phenomenon are unofficial art or underground art. History. For the time of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 until 1932, the historical Russian avant-garde flourished and strived to appeal to the proletariat. However, in 1932 Stalin's government took control of the arts with the publication of On the Reconstruction of Literary Artistic Organizations, a decree that put artists' unions under the control of the Communist Party. 2 years later, Stalin instituted a policy that unified aesthetic and ideological objectives, which was called Socialist Realism, broadly defined as art that was socialist in content and realist in form. Moreover, the new policy defined 4 categories of unacceptable art: political art, religious art, erotic art, and formalistic art, which included abstraction, expressionism, and conceptual art. Beginning in 1936, avant-garde artists who were unable or unwilling to adapt to the new policy were forced out of the positions, and often either murdered or sent to the Gulag, as part of Stalin's Great Purges. Vladimir Sterlegov, a student of Kazimir Malevich, along with 2 of his own students, Alexander Bachin and Oleg Kartashov, as well as Vera Ermoleva and her students Maruyuka Sanskar and Pavel Basmanov, were arrested in December 1934 and taken by train to Kazakhstan. Sterlegov spent 5 years in prison outside Karaganda, while Ermoleva disappeared forever. Sterlegov's student, Alexander Bachin, spent a total of 32 years in prison. In the wake of World War II, referred to in Russia as the Great Patriotic War, party resolutions were passed in 1946 and 1948 by Andrei Zhdanov, chief of the propaganda administration, formally denouncing Western cultural influences at the start of the Cold War. Art students such as Uelo Susta, an Estonian who later became important to the Moscow nonconformist movement, were sent to Siberian prison camps. The nonconformist artist Boris Vesna also spent time in a Soviet labor camp. Oleg Zelkov was expelled from art school for formalism in 1955, which from the viewpoint of the party might have constituted an act of treason. 1953 to 1962, the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev's subsequent denunciation of his rule during his secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in 1956 created a liberal atmosphere wherein artists had more freedom to create non-sanctioned work without fearing repercussions. Furthermore, Stalin's cult of personality was recognized as detrimental, and within weeks many paintings and busts bearing his likeness were removed from public places. Artists such as Alexander Gerasimov, who had made a career as painting idealized portraits of Stalin, were forced out of their official positions, as they had become embarrassing to the new leadership. However, despite increased tolerance, the parameters of socialist realism still hadn't changed, and therefore artists still had to tread lightly. 1962 Mid-1970s the Thaw era ended quickly, when in 1962, Khrushchev attended the Public Manners exhibition at which several nonconformist artists were exhibiting, including Uelo Susta with his eye in the egg. Khrushchev got into a public and now famous argument with Ernst Neesbestny regarding the function of art in society. However, this altercation had the unintended effect of fomenting unofficial art as a movement. Artists could no longer hold illusions that the state would recognize their art. Yet the climate had become friendly and open enough that a coherent organization had formed. Additionally, punishments for unofficial artists became less severe. They were denied admittance to the union instead of being executed. As a movement, nonconformist art was stylistically diverse. However, in the post-Thaw era its function and role in society became clear. As the eminent Russian curator, author and museum director Joseph Backstein writes, "The duality of life in which the official perception of everyday reality is independent of the reality of the imagination leads to a situation where art plays a special role in society. In any culture, art is a special reality, but in the Soviet Union art was doubly real precisely because it had no relation to reality. It was a higher reality. The goal of nonconformism in art was to challenge the status of official artistic reality, to question it, to treat it with irony. Yet that was the one unacceptable thing. All of Soviet society rested on orthodoxy, and nonconformism was its enemy. That is why even the conditional and partial legalization of nonconformism in the mid-1970s was the beginning of the end of the Soviet regime. Late 1970s, 1991s. In the mid-1980s, glasnost and perestroika were the policies that led to the demise of the USSR in 1991. The nonconformist movement, deprived of a host body, suffered demise as well. However, two other factors sealed the fate of nonconformism. The first was the 1988 auction of modern and contemporary Russian art in Moscow by Sotheby's. The auction was only open to foreigners who could pay in British pounds, which signified the economic fragility of the Soviet Union, the end of its xenophobia, and the beginning of the forces of capitalism that control the art market. The second factor was diaspora. Many artists had already emigrated, beginning as early as the late 1970s and continuing throughout the 1980s. Among Leningrad artists who emigrated in the 1970s are to Israel. In 1976, Evgeny Abazgauz, 1976, Tatiana Kornfeld, 1976, Yuri Kalendarev, sculptor who in 1979 moved to Tuscany, Italy, 1977, Sima Ostrovsky, 1979, Anatoly Basin, who from 1994 lives and works in both countries, Jerusalem, Israel, and St. Petersburg, Russia, 1979, Alexander Okun, 1993, Alexander Gurevich, to USA. In 1974, Alexander Ney, sculptor, to New York. 1976, Alek Rapoport emigrated from Leningrad, and in 1977 moved to USA. 1977, Natalia Toreva to Chicago, Illinois. 1980, Evgeny Goruinov, who moved after 2 years to Europe, lived in Austria, Italy, and later in Paris, France, and in 1989 returned to Leningrad, Russia, to France. In 1971, Mikhail Chemyakin was exiled from the Soviet Union to Paris, France, then moved in 1981 to New York, the United States, and currently lives in France. 1977, Alexander F.E.F. In the late 1970s, Yuri Zarkik emigrated to Germany and then moved to Paris, France, where he lives and works now. Contributors to the movement. Notable Soviet nonconformist artists from Moscow include Ernst Neizvostny, Oskar Rybin, Vladimir Yankelevsky, Ilya Kabakov, Oleg Vasiliev, Eric Bulatov, Kamaran Melamed, Leonid Sikov, Viktor Pivovarov, Uelo Suster, Boris Sveshnikov, Vladimir Yakovlev, Anatoly Zverev, Dmitry Plavinsky, Lydia Mastikova, Vladimir Vladimir Nemukin, Eduard Steinberg, Igor Novikov, Mikhail Kulikov, Lev Kropivnitsky, Valentina Kropivnitskaya, Mikhail Odnorilov, Oleg Zelkov, Alexander Ulikov, Andrei Grositsky, Vasily Sitnikov, Dmitry Krasnopevsyev, Leonid Lam, Igor Shelkovsky, and others. From St. Petersburg, Yuri Dishlenko, Evgeny Rukhin, Alek Rapoport, Timur Novikov, Anatoly Basin, Yuri Zarkik, Alexei Kovostenko, Clever, Yuri Gurov, Anatoly Belkin, Alexander Ney, Vladimir Lisanov, Igor V. Ivanov, Natalia Toreva, Evgeny Goruinov, and others. From Siberia, Edward Zelenin, Moscow Artists Groups. There were many artistic groups and movements that were active in the Soviet Union after the period of the thaw. They can be difficult to classify because often they were not related due to stylistic objectives, but geographical proximity. Furthermore, participation in these groups was fluid as the community of nonconformist artists in Moscow was relatively small and close-knit. Lianozovo, one of the most rebellious groups to emerge from this period, is called Lianozovo, after the small village outside Moscow where most of the artists lived and worked. The members of this group were Evgeny Kropivnitsky, Olga Potapova, Valentina Kropivnitskaya, Oskar Rabin, Lev Kropivnitsky, Lydia Mastakova, Vladimir Nemukin, Nikolai Vektomov, and the poets Vsevolod Nekrasov, Genrik Sapgur, and Igor Kolin. This group was not related due to aesthetic concerns, but due to the shared search for a new socio-cultural identity. Quote, "If one generalization may be made of this group's aesthetic preferences and general worldview, it is that the aestheticization of misery is precisely what distinguishes the representatives of the declassed communal intelligentsia of the thaw era from the predecessors, who created a paradisiac image of history." Many members of the Lianozovo group worked in an abstract style. The 1957 thaw resulted in the discovery of Western artistic practices and historical Russian avant-garde traditions by young Soviet artists. Artists began experimenting with abstraction, as it was the antithesis of socialist realism. However, the fallout from the Manez exhibition in 1962 caused restrictions to be enforced once again. The new restrictions could not, however, curtail what the young artists had learned during the 5-year interlude. Additionally, Viktor Tupitsin points out that the 1960s mark an era of decommunalization in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev worked to improve housing conditions, and a consequence of this was that artists began to get studios of their own, or shared spaces with like-minded colleagues. If one is to follow Virginia Woolf's thesis that a room of one's own is the primary necessary factor for the proliferation of creative work, then it is easy to see how nonconformist art began flourishing at this time in the USSR. Officially, those in the Lianozovo group were members of the Moscow Union of Graphic Artists, working in the applied and graphic arts. As such, they were not permitted to hold painting exhibitions, as that fell under the domain of the Artists' Union. Consequently, apartment exhibitions and literary salons began at this time as a means of publicly exhibiting. However, the Lianozovo group in particular was often harassed by Soviet officials as they were vigilant in pursuing public exhibitions of the work. In an attempt to circumvent the law, the Lianozovo group proposed an open-air exhibition in 1974, inviting dozens of other non-conformist artists also to exhibit. The result was the demolition of the exhibition by bulldozers and water cannons, for which reason the exhibition is still known as the Bulldozer Exhibition. Sretonsky Boulevard, a group of artists that had studios on and around Sretonsky Boulevard, Moscow, became a loosely associated like-minded community in the late 1960s. The members of this group were Ilya Kabakov, Uella Suster, Edward Steinberg, Eric Bulatov, Oleg Vasiliev, Viktor Pivovarov, Vladimir Yankolevsky, and Ernst Niesvestny. The artists' studios were also used as venues to show and exchange ideas about unofficial art. Like their colleagues in the Lianozovo group, the majority of visual artists who were part of the Sretonsky Boulevard group were admitted to the Union of Moscow Graphic Artists. This allowed the artists to work officially as book illustrators and graphic designers, which provided them with studio space, materials, and time to work on their own projects. Although they shared the same type of official career, the Sretonsky group is not stylistically homogeneous. The name merely denotes the community that they formed as a result of working in close proximity to each other. Moscow conceptualists. However, many of the artists on Sretonsky Boulevard were part of the Moscow conceptualist school. This movement arose in the 1970s to describe the identity of the contemporary Russian artist in opposition to the government. As Joseph Backstein explains, the creation of this nonconformist tradition was impelled by the fact that an outsider in the Soviet Empire stood alone against a tremendous state machine, a great leviathan that threatened to engulf him. To preserve one's identity in this situation, one had to create a separate value system, including a system of aesthetic values. The aesthetic language of Moscow conceptualism is self-conscious and often deals with the quotidian. Consequently, these artists incorporated their experiences of Soviet life into their art in a manner that was not overtly negative, but at varying times nostalgic, disinterested, and subtle. Eric Bulatov explains that conceptualist art is a rebellion of man against the everyday reality of life. A picture interests me as some kind of system, opening into the space of my everyday existence. By exposing the underlying mechanisms of Soviet society and interpersonal interaction, the artists created a very real and relatable artistic language to rival the official propagandistic language of the government. This group includes Ilya Kabakov, Eric Bulatov, Oleg Vasiliev, Kamaran Melamed, Ivan Chukov, Viktor Pivovarov, and also broadly encompasses the SOTS artists and the Collective Actions group, which were both influential in the construction of Russian conceptualist art. The term Moscow conceptualism is sometimes used interchangeably with postmodernism, and is sometimes erroneously meant to include all of the nonconformist artists of the Soviet generation. Quote, "This term applies both to specific artists who were born in the 1930s and 1940s, grew up under Stalinism and came of age in the 1960s, and to certain artists of the next generation that were born in the 1950s, like the core of the Collective Actions group." Both these groups took nonconformist art in a new direction in the 1970s. The Petersburg groups, 1960s–1970s. Mikhail Chemyakin's Petersburg Nonconformist group developed out of a 1964 exhibition at the Hermitage Museum, where Chemyakin worked as gallery assistant. The official name of the exhibition was Exhibition of the Artist Workers of the Economic Part of the Hermitage, towards the 200th anniversary of Hermitage, and it included the work of Chemyakin, V. Kravchenko, V. Ufliand, V. Ovchinnikov and O. Liagachev. Opening on March 30–31, it was closed by the authorities on April 1. The Hermitage director, Mikhail Artemanov, was removed from his post. In 1967, the Petersburg Group Manifesto was written and signed by Chemyakin, O. Liagachev, E. Yesorlenko and V. Ivanov and Chemyakin had previously developed the idea of metaphysical synthetism, which proposed creating a new form of icon painting through the study of religious art across the ages. The essay Metaphysique Synthetisme included illustrations to the works of V. T. A. Hoffman and Crime and Punishment by Fyodor M. Dostoevsky, A. Vassiliev, and the miniature painter V. Makarenko joined the group later. 4 years after the founding of the group, in 1971, Chemyakin emigrated to France, and later the United States, Liagachev, until his emigration to Paris in 1975, and Vassiliev continued to participate in exhibitions of nonconformist artists in Leningrad at the Gaza Palace of Culture and the Nevsky Palace of Culture. Liagachev's work in this period includes Kafka, Into Many XX and Composition, Canon. The group finally became defunct in 1979, ceasing to have joint exhibitions. Before the famous nonconformist Gaza Nevsky exhibitions in Leningrad, there were also 3 unofficial exhibitions at the Kositsky Palace of Culture in 1968–1969. Mainly the group of artists who participated were Yuri Nasheviknikov, Anatoly Basin, Igor Ivanov, Natalia Toreva, Evgeny Goruinov, and others, who were from the School of Seidelin, the art studio at the Kapranov Palaces of Culture. In 1974, the first exhibition of nonconformist artists took place at the Gaza Palace of Culture, Leningrad, Russia. This exhibition was very short. It took only 4 days, but it was the historical event. In 1975, another unofficial art exhibition took place at the Nevsky Palace of Culture, Leningrad, Russia. In the 1970s, a new direction took place in an unofficial art movement in Leningrad. Many artists participated in nonconformist unofficial exhibitions which were held in the private apartments, so-called apartment exhibitions. Some examples of the unofficial apartment exhibitions are: in November 1975, the first Jewish exhibition, Aleph, also known as 12 from the Soviet Underground, took place in E. Abasgaz's apartment, where the following 12 Jewish artists participated: Evgeny Abasgaz, Anatoly Basin, Leonid Bolmat, Alexander Gurevich, Yuri Kalendarev, Tatyana Kornfeld, Alexander Manusov, Alexander Okun, Sima Ostrovsky, Alek Rapoport, Osip Seidelin, and Olga Shmulavich. In 1976, the catalogue of the 12 from the Soviet Underground was published in California, USA, reflecting this historical exhibition of the Jewish artists that took place in November 23–30, 1975 in the E. Abasgaz's apartment, and where over 4,000 people viewed this exhibition. In 1976, the second Aleph exhibition took place in E. Abasgaz's apartment, where such artists as E. Abasgaz, A. F.F. A. Basin, R. Vasmy, A. Gurevich, Y. Kalendarev, Tikhona, T. Kornfeld, A. Okun, S. Ostrovsky, A. Rapoport, O. Seidelin, G. Shapiro, S. Schwartz, O. Shmulavich, and others participated. In 1976, before his emigration from Russia, Alek Rapoport organized an exhibition in his apartment where many artists, including Evgeny Goruinov, Natalia Toreva, and others participated with their artwork. In March 1977, there was the Self-Portrait and Portrait exhibition, organized in their apartment by Rima and Igor M. Loganov, who was the engineer and Leningrad art collector. The following artists were presented: E. Abasgaz, Anatoly Basin, G. Bogomolov, S. Gershov, E. Goruinov, Igor Ivanov, B. Kozlov, A. Krasnovsky, A. Marev, Osip Seidelin, Natalia Toreva, B. Soselsky, Shapiro. The apartment exhibitions were important places not only for the exhibition itself but also became a place where people could meet and discuss freely and openly about the art, painting, poetry, etc. In 2005, 1950–1980 book, compiled by Larissa Skobkina, the curator of the Central Exhibition Hall, managed to reflect the unofficial art groups formed around the artists and teachers such as V. Sterlegov, P. Kondrashev, O. Seidlin, G. Delugak, N. Akimov, S. Levin, and others. It includes also the artists who did not belong to any art groups, but still played a notable role in the nonconformist movement at that time. St. Petersburg, Russia. OCLC 637,824,734. School of Seidlin. OSIP Seidlin was educated at VKHUTEMAS. He studied under Alexander Osmerkin, Alexander Savinov, Kozma Petrov-Vodkin, and also was in contact with Kazimir Malevich. Starting in the middle of the 1930s, OSIP Seidlin was teaching art in Leningrad at such art schools as the Ilyich Palaces of Culture, the first 5-year Palace of Culture, and also at the Kapranov Palace of Culture till his death in 1972. Among his students were the following artists: Anatoly Basin, Galina Basina, Vladimir Egorov, Anatoly Golovastov, Evgeny Goruinov, Igor V, Ivanov, Galina Ivanova, Boris Kupin, Alexander Mihailovsky, Yuri Nasheviknikov, Sergei Sivitsev, Natalia Toreva, Margarita Trushina, Vasily Yusko, and poet Yuli Goldstein, who provided to the group the wider vision not only to the art, but also to the literature and poetry. The Sterlegov group. Vladimir Sterlegov was the student of Kazimir Malevich, P. Filanov, and all his life followed K. Malevich's principles of cubism and suprematism in this artistic tradition. His followers were A. Bacharin, M. Srush, G. Zubkov, and others. Pavel Kondrashev was also the student of Kazimir Malevich, P. Filanov, A. Savinov at the Academy of Arts V. K. Putin, and collaborated with V. Sterlegov and T. Glebova at that time and later. So, they both have the same kind of niche in art, where the followers and pupils were in one group or another, but followed the same kind of principles in art. The Afiev Circle. Alexander Afiev was a leader of the nonconformist group in Leningrad. He was expelled from the Soviet Union in 1977, and soon died in Paris in 1978. The group included the following artists: A. Afiev, Valentin Gromov, Richard Vasmy, Vladimir Shagan, Shalom Schwartz, Natalia Zhelina, who was close to this group, and the poet Roald Mandelstam, who provided to the group the inspiration for their artwork. They called the group as the Order of Mendicant Painters, and were recognized only after the starting of the new nonconformists movement in Leningrad and the participation in the exhibitions at the Gaza Palaces of Culture and the Nevsky Palaces of Culture. The other nonconformist artists, besides the artists, participated as the schools or groups described above. These artists participated individually in the important time of the Soviet nonconformist art. They took the active part in the unofficial art, including the participation in the apartment exhibitions and in the unofficial art exhibitions, such as the famous nonconformist Gaza-Nevsky exhibitions in Leningrad in the mid-1970s. In 1990, the album The Artists of the Gaza-Nevsky Culture, compiled by E. Andreeva, and published as a part of the Contemporary Leningrad Avant-Garde series in St. Petersburg, Russia. The following artists were included in this album among other founders of the Gazanevsky culture: Evgeny Abazgaz, Valentin Afanasiev, Anatoly Belkin, Mikhail Chemyakhin, Yuri Dishlenko, Vadim Filomenov, Yuri Galetsky, Vladlen Gavrilchik, Tatiana Kerner, Vitaly Kubasov, Mikhail Kulikov, Nikolai Lubashkin, Alexander Manusov, Yuri Medvedev, Vladimir Mishailov, Alexander Mirev, Evgeny Mikhnov, Voitenko, Vladimir Nekrasov, Alexander Okun, Vladimir Ovchinnikov, Yuri Petrochenkov, Alek Rapopod, Yuli Rybakov, Evgeny Rukhin, Igor Sinyavin, Igor Tulpanov, Gennady Ustugov, Igor Zakharov, and others. The 1980s. Timur Novikov was one of the leaders of St. Petersburg art in the 1980s. In 1982, his theory of zero object acted as one of the foundations of Russian conceptual art. In the 1990s he founded Neo-Academism. St. Petersburg artists Igor Polyakov and Alexander Rapoport formed the underground art group Battle Elephants in 1984. Olga Kiseleva was one of the leaders of Russian new media art. Another important St. Petersburg artist who emerged in the 1980s was Africa, the Odessa Group. By the mid-1970s, in Odessa a core group of nonconformist artists was formed whose most active members were Vladimir Strelnikov, Alexander Anafrev, Valentin Krush, Viktor Mariniuk, Lyudmila Yastreb, Stanislav Sychev, Lev Mishberg, Evgeny Rachmanin, Ruslan Makoev, Andrei Antoniuk, and others. These artists continued to show their art privately in spite of the constant harassment from the authorities and the oppression and hatred coming. For the majority of the officially recognized artists, they had close connections with the Moscow centers of the underground art movement and were participating in the apartment exhibitions of nonconformist art in Moscow and in Leningrad. They also invited the Russian colleagues to visit Odessa and to take part in their apartment exhibitions there. The following artists took an active part in the unofficial, so-called apartment exhibitions in the 1970s in Odessa. Some of them participated in the apartment exhibitions in Moscow as well: Valentin Altany, Andrei Antoniuk, Alexander Anafrev, Valery Basani, Alexei Bokatov, Igor Bozhko, Nadia Haiduk, Valentin Krush, Mikhail Kowalski, Ruslan Makoev, Viktor Mariniuk, Volodymyr Naumez, Nikolai Novikov, Viktor Pavlov, Valery Parfenko, Evgeny Rachmanin, Viktor Isavich, Sergei Savchenko, Vitaly Sazonov, Valentin Shapavlenko, Yuri Shurevich, Oleg Sokolov, Nikolai Stepanov, Alexander Stovber, Vladimir Strelnikov, Stanislav Sychov, Vladimir Zipko, Alexander Voloshinov, Lyudmila Yastreb, Anna Zilberman,